So good morning everyone and welcome to Queen's Business School and the second in this series of the Business Breakfast Insights. Today our focus is on global trade tariffs. What do tariff changes mean for Northern Ireland's export-driven businesses? Firstly, we will hear from Richard Ramsey, economist and recently appointed Professor of Practice in Economics and Policy in Queen's Business School, followed by a panel discussion with leading experts chaired by Dr. Michael Aldous. You then will have a choice of 3 breakout sessions where you can discuss topics in more detail with the relevant panel members and academics in the area. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Richard to give the keynote speech.
Okay, thanks very much, Julie, and good morning, everybody. It's good to see some new faces and familiar faces, and it's not as if this morning we've got much to talk about. I also noticed that there was a few Teslas in the car park, and so any Tesla drivers here, you know who you were. So, if there's one word, what is the one word that comes to mind about how things are at the minute? Anybody? Uncertainty. And if you sort of think, well, we always have uncertainty in business and in the economy. How bad are how are the levels of uncertainty? How do they compare to historic levels? And there is a World Uncertainty Index, which is calculated by the number of times that the word uncertainty appears in economics intelligence reports, and economists are able to track that. And you can see the World Uncertainty Index over a period of time where it's been, and lo and behold, April, it has jumped up to record highs. And clearly the problem with uncertainty is uncertainty hits confidence, confidence hits the economy, hits growth, impacts on employers, their hiring intentions, etc. And it's clearly not a good thing to have. So we'll go into uncertainty in a bit more detail, but it's good to sort of like track and just mark the pitch, as it were, for Trump and Trump 2.0. So this is Trump's second term in office, but just to go through Trump, what he's all about. We know about trade and tariffs, and we're going to come onto that. He's also about tax cuts. He wants to make one of the bills earlier this week was the temporary tax cuts, which were introduced back in 2017. He wants to make them permanent, although he's also talking about he's doing a bit of a pivot and doing tax increases for the wealthy, which wasn't what people were thinking. Taiwan is going to be a key issue as the tension with China mounts up. Trump's all about deregulation, and one of his catchphrases was, particularly in the energy industry, where it was he wanted to drill, baby, drill, in terms of opening up to more drilling for oil, but given where the oil price is going at the minute, there isn't going to be much drilling. Also, in terms of deregulating and in terms of regulation, he's rolling back a lot of the green energy sort of deals that the Biden administration introduced. There's also Russia. He seems to be more friendly with Putin than Biden was. But one of the key things about Trump is, as you have no doubt be aware of, is the uncertainty, unpredictability, how he's flip-flopped sort of with Ukraine, implications there, how he's then slashed the spending of US AID in terms of the US Economic Development Agency. Also, given that we're in a university here, in terms of universities as well, he seems to be then attacking the universities. He's looking at reducing the budgets and grants going to a lot of the Ivy League universities. Mass deportations, the Middle East, Mexico, and also Elon Musk as well, who's going through with his the Doge guys, the Department of Government Efficiency, or they're referred to as Doge bags by some people, and they're looking at getting efficiencies. And then, of course, there's protectionism, price rises, particularly from the tariffs, which consumers will face. Public finances, also a big issue. Remember, while the US economy's been experiencing really strong growth of late, it has got significant deficit, and it's been on the back of a splurge of spending in QE back during the COVID years, where at one point the Federal Reserve was printing money to the tune of $1 million per second. Then there's also the issue of Panama as well, and it's looking to take over Trump's looking to take over the Panama Canal, and I'll sort of talk about that sort of later on. But when we think of Trump 1, because we're seeing all this kind of tension with global trade, tariffs, etc. That's not new. You can see this was back in 2018, the front pages of the Economist magazine, and Trump was all into conflict, particularly with China, and it was almost kind of exclusively with China. And on that front, and with tariffs, he has form. And you can see here, this is then just looking at a trade policy uncertainty index. And this is linked by looking at the trade policy and uncertainty, where those terms come together. And it's a number of people in the Federal Reserve do that by looking at some key newspapers, mostly in the US. And they've done that right back since 1960. So whenever we've seen shocks in the 70s or in kind of 1990s, it pales into insignificance compared to what happened in Trump in his first term of office, as highlighted there. But when we talk about uncertainty, first of all, before we go on to Trump 2, in the intervening years in terms of Biden economics, it was essentially protectionism on steroids. There was huge subsidies given to green technology. It was all about reshoring manufacturing firms back. And there still was tariffs as well. So only this time last year, Joe Biden was increasing tariffs on Chinese electrical vehicles by 100%, 50% on semiconductors, etc. So it's not new. But you've got to think of this, the big global picture of what is actually happening and why the US is doing what it's doing. And it was summed up here by a former US official who's in charge of export controls. America has always wanted to maintain a technological edge over other economic powers. These days, we're pursuing that goal in a new way. We have moved from a run faster to a run faster and trip the other guy up policy. And we can clearly see that today, that's what the US is trying to trip people up. And then Jake Sullivan, who was Joe Biden's national security advisor, again, it shows the whole focus is on maintaining technological lead above China is not enough. Instead, we must have a large lead as possible in chip making, quantum computing, AI, biotechnology, and clean technology. And in many areas, China has overtaken the US on that front. So they're looking at impeding technology advances over China and Russia. And we've seen that over the years with chip wars and all the kind of restrictions which are trying to go on for, particularly in technology, for companies and countries dealing with China. So then we've got Trump 2, and he's came into office January of this year. And what is different is instead of doing tariffs on China, he's firing those tariffs at everybody. And look what's happened to the trade policy uncertainty index. We've had to rebase this. So, and this is where Trump, as of April, this is where the level of trade policy uncertainty is. So whenever people are saying, oh, business, sure, you always have to deal with uncertainty, this is unprecedented. It's 7 times the level of uncertainty that was pre-Trump 1 and 4 times the level of policy uncertainty since then. And we know what we've seen, how that's occurred in recent months has been the tariffs on Mexico and Canada, which were initially imposed, then there was a pause, then they were reimposed a month later. There's been tariffs on Venezuela oil, then there's been the whole tariffs, the Liberation Day on the 2nd of April, where the whole world was dished out its tariffs. And the whole chopping and changing has been extremely difficult. What has happened here in terms of looking at, particularly just on US and China, you can see the chart on the left. The top chart is the additional tariffs that the US was applying on China, and you can see there was this frenzy, particularly in April, where increasing the tariffs by 34%, 50%, 41%. So it was then up to a total additional tariff of 145%. And you can see the chart below was how China was retaliating. And whenever you get up to those levels of 145%, and it was 125% for China imposing on US imports, that basically leads to kind of trade embargoes, and we've already seen that with ships coming to the ports of US. Some of the US ports have seen the port traffic down 50% kind of year on year. The Donald then had his Liz Truss moment, and we all know about the kind of difficulties with financial markets, sell-off in equities. We then had the dollar fell, which was a surprise because normally in times of crisis, the dollar rises as a safe haven asset. Also in terms of US treasuries, they normally, money flies into there because it's a safe haven, whereas the opposite was occurring. And the only way to kind of summarize all those kind of impacts up on a chart is with this cartoon here, where Donald had his Wile E. Coyote moment, and thankfully he stepped back from the brink. And one of the things to notice you may have seen if you read Financial Times, there's one of their journalists, Rob Armstrong, has talked about TACO, and that's Trump always chickens out. And Trump chickened out because of the difficulties. While initially, after this kind of Looney Tunes moment, he paused the tariffs that he imposed on the rest of the world outside of China, and had a 90-day pause on that. Then he's also this week, he was then cutting the tariffs. There was mutual reduction in tariffs right back down to, so the additional tariffs are now only 30% and 10%. But just to bear in mind, even with those tariffs back at the reduced levels, Bloomberg estimate that will still reduce Chinese imports or American imports of Chinese goods by 70%, even at these levels. So the fun isn't over yet. Then just to look at the effective level of tariff rates. So this is across all goods in terms of the US. You can see, and it's the tariff rate as customs duty revenue as a proportion of good imports. So that looks at the effective tariff rate. You can see historically where it had been for years pre-Trump, but now Trump has then jacked up all these tariffs, and we're now at a position it's going to be, when you balance everything out across all the goods and all the different variations in terms of the tariffs, about 18%. That's at a level not seen since 1934, which was when the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act came in after the Great Depression, and it was a disaster. And if anybody, the first time I heard about Smoot-Hawley was in the Ferris Bueller's Day Off film, 1986. There's an economic scene there which talks about Smoot-Hawley. And so that just shows where we are. Going forward, even though we've had these sort of changes, the potential is we're still going to see more tariffs to come. Just then now turning to the only slide of the day on the Northern Ireland economy. So how is Northern Ireland economy focusing? This is looking at the private sector, and it's the Northern Ireland, the Ulster Bank, it's PMI, or private sector survey. Chart on the left is business activity. Anything above the horizontal line 50 is growth. The higher the number, the faster the rate of growth. Conversely, anything below that is decline. The lower the number, the faster the rate of contraction. And you can see that the last 4 months, we've seen private business activity has fallen month on month. Similarly, whenever we look across at employment as well, Northern Ireland has unemployment rate record lows, but we're now starting to see 3 consecutive months of private sector employment now falling. Now, this has nothing to do with Trump tariffs. This is Partly one of the reasons could be due with another type of tariff, which is the Rachel Reeves tariff, or the employers' national insurance contributions now starting to kick in and weigh on private sector business sentiment. Now, just looking at some of the sector-specific issues, we had the UK trade deal, which anybody who has, from a legal perspective, has sort of poked fun at how thin this deal is. And I suppose some of the key takeaways with it are on the car industry. The UK car industry was going to be in difficulties. Remember, there was tariffs going to be 25% additional tariffs. On top of 2.5% was 27.5% for UK cars like Jaguar Land Rover, then exporting to the US. That has now been cut to zero for the first 100,000 cars, and anything above that's 10%. So what's interesting is you saw in the news, and the politicians are celebrating that as a success, and that's like kind of like celebrating like you've lost 20 quid but found a tenner, and you celebrate the tenner and don't talk about the 20 quid. Things are still worse off than they were before, and while there's been some carve-outs in agriculture, everywhere else, all the other areas are getting an additional 10% tariff, which is going to cause problems. We have the UK-EU reset deal, which is going to be next week, and I expect we'll probably see something on the food and agriculture sector, which will be good news, aligning UK and EU, given the problems that has had with Northern Ireland and Brexit, Windsor Framework, and all of those kind of things. Then just looking at some of the other issues, when you can see why has Donald Trump done a taco, or Trump always chicken out? If you look at the US toy makers, the likes of Mattel, 80% of the US toys come from China. And what was going to happen, particularly in the run-up to Christmas, there was going to be empty shelves. You were already having, like, Mattel, one of the #1 toy makers in the world, was looking at reshoring to Vietnam. But lo and behold, there's been this pause. So then there's been this stop-start on this kind of toy front. And you've seen Donald Trump mocking sort of Barbie dolls, and how many dolls, and that American people could live with a couple of dolls as opposed to 30, and all this kind of stuff. One of the interesting things is on this lights camera tariffs is on the film industry. So Trump last week had then mentioned that he's wanting to then target the film industry by applying 100% tariffs on film production outside of the US. And clearly that would have impacts for the likes of UK, Northern Ireland. Film industry's been doing really well. And 2/3 of the film production spend in the UK in 2024 was made up of the 5 big US studios and Apple, Netflix, and Amazon. So clearly there'll be problems there. It's also highlighting that Trump is moving into services, and it's not just goods. And you can see there may be a surcharge coming on any subtitles sometime soon. Then we've got a big issue is Farmageddon, and it's what's going to happen with the pharmaceutical industry, not just in terms of tariffs, because we still don't know what the tariffs are going to be, but what Donald Trump has then talked about this week is then about prices. What he wants to do is level the world's drug prices for prescription drugs. So in the US, prescription drugs are about 3 times that of the UK. He wants to reduce US drugs prescription prices by 30 to 80%. Seems great for the UK or for the US consumer and all the MAGA faithful. But what he wants is then those US companies to then level up. So in the likes of the UK, the NHS, it will have to increase its prices. And similarly around Europe, so that leveling up. And clearly that will have implications for public finances, which are already stretched if you're then going to have to spend even more money on the same drugs that you previously had. That's a big issue to watch for. Also in terms of the US is wanting pharmaceutical firms to come back to US and reshore. That's going to be an issue, particularly for Ireland. And we can see how Irish eyes aren't smiling. Dan O'Brien was then talking about the Liberation Day on the 2nd of April. What was happening there was that there was going to be that the impact of tariffs and what was going to happen could potentially hit the Irish economy harder than the 2010 bailout. also in terms of Ireland, remember pharmaceutical, the Irish Republic is the third largest exporter of pharmaceuticals in the world. But half, and largely this is leading to the huge corporation tax gains in the south, which is leading to the budget surplus, which is all funding infrastructure, etc. But about half of that is an accounting based, and that could change, particularly if Trump starts changing some of the tax issues which helped create that. And the finance minister also talking about it being a significant challenge. So just what's next and what lies ahead? Steve Bannon, Trump's PR advisor, in his first term, talked about flooding the zone for PR. Trump has flooded the zone with uncertainty and chaos, and that's not going to really change anytime soon. That hits confidence and growth. Also, what we notice, the America First policy, Donald Trump has created nationalism in Canada, which never existed before, where all countries are now putting their own countries first, and it's now a move more from coercion rather than cooperation. That's going to be sort of difficult going forward, particularly when we think of the climate change, climate emergency. If there's no cooperation to get that, it ain't going to happen. Trade policy isn't about economics anymore. It's about power and security. And geopolitics is now center stage. We just think of what's happening in India, Pakistan, Middle East, Ukraine, etc. All hugely important. But at these difficult times, and it was 80th year of VE victory in Europe last week, we have to think of the Churchillian spirit and go to end in some positives. Difficulties mastered are opportunities won, and the pessimist, which I probably put myself in that camp, sees the difficulty in every opportunity, whereas the optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty, and we have to see the opportunity in every difficulty now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Lovely. Lots of uncertainty to think about. If you actually look at this in the very long view, we shouldn't be that surprised about what's happening at the moment. Historically, we've seen enormous global resets in the trade environment. So there is quite a lot we can draw on when we think about how to respond to these challenges. I'm delighted to be joined today by three really interesting speakers who have a lot to say to these issues. At the end there, we've got Patrick Collins, who's the CFO at the Belfast Distillery Co. You'll probably know that more through their top brand, McConnell's. And then we've got Lorraine Nelson, BDO NI, Head of Tax, who will keep us right on all of the many tax and compliance issues we're going to have to think about as we start to address these challenges. And Gareth Hagan, CEO, OCO Global, a consultancy that has been dealing and helping companies and governments to facilitate trade for a long time now. So we're going to have a discussion with each of our speakers, a couple of them potentially questions from the audience, and then you can also think about other questions that we can take through then into the breakout sessions. So I'm going to start then with Patrick, right at the sharp end, a lot of interests in the US. Maybe you could give us a sense of what this has meant for you in the last month as whiskey's become a bit of a political football within these trade negotiations. How's it been?
Thank you, Michael. And firstly, thank you very much for yourself, for Julie, for Carl and the Queen's Business School to give an opportunity for Belfast Distillery Company to, I suppose, outline what we're seeing in our industry. When you look at the media coverage recently, since this has blown up, you know, the auto industry, steel and aluminium, pharma, as Richard mentioned, has closely been followed by the whisky sector as an example of what can go wrong, both in the Scottish whisky sector and also in the Irish whisky sector. So I'm delighted that I can come along to here today and sort of give people a little more insight as to what's happening in our world and how much uncertainty actually is in our world. Just a brief intro to the Belfast Distillery Company. We own the McConnell's Irish Whiskey brand. We launched the brand in 2020. We're selling at McConnell's in over 44 markets, I think, last count, globally. The other element of our business is that we have a distillery that we opened, and visitor experience that we opened last April 2024. So we're now distilling Irish whiskey in Belfast. We bring in Irish whiskey back home to Belfast, where it predominated the sector back in the day. So our business is twofold. It's a sale of Irish whiskey, production and sale of Irish whiskey, and then also a visitor experience and hospitality event space as well. Roughly, when you look at our sort of forecast, half our volume and revenue is in the brand, and within that brand, 40% is where US lies in terms of where our product's going. So it's a very important, it's the biggest market for Irish whiskey in the world, which is obvious. But when you look at the entire business, it's probably just less than 20%. So it's material enough of an exposure to our market that we need to be concerned with, but it's not critical to our overall business model, given that we've got some diversification in our business. But that's not to understate how damaging this period of uncertainty is to our business and to our sector. I can only speak on behalf of Belfast Distillery Company, but I know it's shared by the Irish Whisky Association, who is the trade body that represents Irish whisky north and south. Tariffs are bad. Tariffs are bad. There's been a little bit of media, excitement, I think about a month ago, saying that this is a real opportunity for Northern Irish whisky producers. That may be the case for some, but it's probably going to be short-lived. The reason for that is that the Irish whisky sector, its supply chain is so interwoven between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So any sort of short gains in terms of differentials and tariffs that may apply to some distilleries over others will be short-lived. So I wanted to put a couple of examples where this uncertainty is causing us some difficulty. First of all, I wanted to sort of focus on those terms of rules of origin and that wonderful term, substantial transformation. So rather than talk about it, I thought I'd bring along one of our products. This is not a piece of opportunistic marketing, or certainly not an advocacy for drinking whiskey for breakfast, although I could think of worse things. But I thought this would be a useful example to explain to people, how complicated our supply chain is and the impacts that we have to consider now. So if you look down that beautiful bottle of McConnell's, that's our sherry cask finish. It's a 5-year blend, 40% malt, 60% grain. I'll come back to that later on when I talk. But if I look at the bottle itself first, and you look at its various components, we started at the top. So the stopper, or the cap, is at 2 parts. It's actually got the plastic stopper, as it's called, and then that's attached to the cork. So the stopper is sourced from the UK at the minute. The cork comes from Portugal, so it's EU. The little bit of plastic that sort of seals it is EU. The bottle is sourced in the UK. That little shoulder badge, as it's called there, is sourced in the EU, but we've just found a supplier in the US. The label currently is coming from the south of Ireland, so EU. But again, we've got another potential option in Northern Ireland. So alone in that bottle, there's already different sources and different routes from different supply chains to get into what is that finished product for us. In terms of the process, although the bottle comes from UK, the bottling process is actually done in the south of Ireland. The liquid that, the all-important liquid that's in the bottle, it's sourced in the south of Ireland as well. Some of the more astute may ask, well, hang on, you just told us you're opening a distillery in Belfast, you're manufacturing malt whiskey in Belfast, Northern Ireland. That is true, but anybody who knows anything about whiskey knows that it needs to mature at least for 3 years before it can actually be sold as Irish whiskey. In our case, it's 5 years for this particular bottle. So we've had to build up an inventory of liquid malt and grain whiskey from primarily the south of Ireland. And that will be the case for the next 4 years, because we've only produced for a year, so it's going to take another 4 years or a second before we can actually sell whiskey produced in McConnell's in Belfast. So in that liquid, the components of that liquid is 40% malt and 60% grain whiskey, 2 different types of whiskey that's blended together. They are matured in barrels or casks. Now, in this particular case, the first 5 years of maturation, it's matured in a bourbon, US bourbon barrel, which comes from the US. Okay, so that's a raw material that's come from the US. Then that liquid is transferred after 5 years and finished, what's called finished in our trade, in a sherry cask. That sherry cask was sourced from Spain. So we're back to the EU again. And then finally, whenever the bottle is put into its outer cases and shipped across the world, that shipper case has been sourced in the UK. So you can see how complicated, what looks like a simple bottle of Irish whiskey, how complicated the supply chain is. Now, what does that mean in terms of the landscape of tariffs? We don't know yet because the sands are shifting almost on a weekly, if not daily basis. So when we look back to the start of the current announcement, I guess, from Trump, Liberation Day, I think Richard called it, the 10% blanket tariff was an immediate impact on us as every other industry. Very quickly, that escalated whenever Trump announced that he wanted to apply 20% to EU products. That then led to countermeasures, where, including other products, the EU listed bourbon as a potential countermeasure to stand up to these the tariffs coming from the US to the EU. Not just on bourbon, but on bourbon barrels. Okay, so then there was seen to be a little bit of diplomacy kicked in to the conversations between the EU and the US. I think there was a proposal from the EU that you would drop bourbon from its countermeasures, and then there was a suggestion that there would be a zero for zero tariff arrangement between EU and US, particularly for whiskey and spirits from other sources of countries in Europe. That was, I think, initially accepted by Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary in the States, but it seemed to have been kicked back by somebody higher up in the White House. So that resulted only last week in an announcement by the EU that because they had previously dropped that threat to apply an import duty on bourbon and bourbon barrels, that's now back on the table. So that's where we are as of today. The term, Irish eyes are not smelling. Certainly Irish whiskey eyes are not smelling, because not only are we looking at price increases that we have to pass on to our customers that will impact demand, obviously, but we've got also, the potential of 25% import tariffs being applied by the EU on barrels that we obviously need as part of our product that you can see here. So we're going to be hit by both ends of the supply chain as things stand at the minute. But we don't know, because we don't know what's going to happen this time next week and, where things will land. So there's no point in us trying to figure out where the rules of origin or the substance of transformation of this product lies. We think it's going to be EU. I think it's obvious it's going to be EU. If that's the case, then it sets us from the really, again, in the current state of play, in a really, really uncompetitive space, particularly now that, there was a big announcement last week in India and the UK that has relaxed tariffs for UK whiskies by 50%. There was 150% tariff for whiskey going to the India. It's now going to be 75 if you're a UK distiller. But we're probably not going to fall into that. Now, we can change our supply chain. We can, at some stage, side the bottle in Northern Ireland. So the process transfers from the south of Ireland. We've been doing that in the south of Ireland for commercial reasons for years, but we may now have to consider bringing that, and we'd like to bring it actually in-house. So, as I said, we can just shop around for different suppliers and try to bring as much of the raw material back into Northern Ireland and therefore into the UK arena. But that's going to take some time and some investment. So that's one impact. I decided to reach out to our US importer to see from what's the impact from their side. Obviously, price increase is going to make our product more uncompetitive on the retail shops and bars in the US. It also is, we're a relatively new player in the market, albeit we've been in place for the last 5-6 years. But the bigger players, the bigger importers in the US, obviously foresaw that Trump potentially could win the US election. They were able to stock buy and bring forward orders tariffs. So the bigger importers have got warehouses now full of tariff-free Irish whiskey, Scots whiskey, etc. Our importer just didn't have the resource to do that. So there's that competitive. That's going to cause some market disruption as well. And then the final, current impact that they're seeing is that from a purchasing perspective, they're holding back on orders because they want to see how this 90-day sort of respite period pans out before they actually place any orders. So again, lots of uncertainty for our US importer. Looking at other factors that are impacting us, we are US owned, or most of our investors are US based. If we do decide to bring bottling back into Northern Ireland, we will have to invest and probably will raise some additional equity to do so. That's more than likely going to be sourced in the US. And everybody knows what's going on in the stock market. Obviously, it's had a bit of a bounce back in the last few days. But I know from talking to our board members and investors that raising capital in the US is very, very difficult at the minute for not just for us, but for most other investment people who are revising their investment strategies whilst this period of uncertainty rumbles on. But then again, Richard touched on the weakening dollar. When we do get that equity from the US, it's going to buy less pounds. And similarly, our revenue, that could be hit because of higher pricing. It's been sold in US in dollars in the States. So yeah, that's not a good place to be as well. So thankfully, as I said earlier, we are diversified. We can absorb these shocks. We need to ride out, get this period of clarity or lack of clarity behind us, and then we can make some real decisions about our supply chain and hopefully move forward to a place where we'd rather be as opposed to where we are now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Patrick. Busy times. Sounds a lot of complexity in sort of managing that supply chain and thinking about where that's going to end up. On that note, I'm going to come over to Gareth. Gareth, you've huge amount of experience thinking about companies and governments and facilitating trade. What do you think are some of the sort of the ripple effects as we think about these tariffs and the complexity that they're creating now in the global environment? What's your sense of how this is going to play out and what companies should be thinking about, not necessarily in the very short term, but also looking a little bit further forward to the medium term?
Yeah, thanks. Good morning, everybody, and good to be here as well, Izzy. And it's interesting because I've been actually traveling almost as much as your bottle in the last sort of 3 or 4 weeks, and maybe actually as I'm sort of talking, I might kind of recount some of my experiences in different parts of the world to talk to some of what we're talking about today. Just by quick way of introduction, OCO Global, we're a Belfast-based firm. We really do one thing, which is advise around trade and investment. And if there's any small crumb of comfort from what's going on in the world at the moment, it means that I no longer have to explain what I do as much as I used to in the past, basically, which was always interesting when I met someone down the pub, basically, and tried to do that. But this is kind of front page news more than middle of the paper news, which is historically where maybe this has been. Look, a couple of thoughts from me, and maybe I'll kind of start kind of at the top and work my way down. Trump took us all to the top of the hill, didn't he, on Liberation Day? We've sort of been slowly climbing down that hill over the last 2 or 3 days, and Richard's charts kind of were testimony to that in terms of some of the kind of the backtracking that's happened, basically kind of like the taco phrase, actually. So I think I'll use that one. But it's been happening over the last kind of couple of weeks, and the reality is that was probably the plan, right? We kind of know how Trump operates and the style of politics and the art of the deal and all that. But what I would sort of caution though is that it isn't going to go back to the way it was. So it's not going to go back to, the chart isn't going to level out at kind of where it was kind of before all this started. And so that being the case, basically, we've got to deal with it, right? It's got to basically, what is it that you do when you deal with it? Look, our business is kind of split in 2 halves, really. We advise governments on one side and we advise companies on the other side that are looking to internationalize their business. So I'll maybe kind of try and share some perspectives from what I see on both sides of that sort of divide, as it were. I think, first of all, it's clear to see that we have set off a sort of chain reaction here in terms of kind of things that have now happened as a result of Trump taking us to the top of the hill. What do I mean by that? We're seeing basically kind of trade patterns and trade deals and trade agreements kind of taking a different form across the world. Look at the UK in the last week, basically. A trade deal agreed with India, which was actually a trade deal in name at least, basically agreed with the US, basically, which kind of the kind of the chain reaction, the trigger basically to both of those things was what's happening kind of a macro level. And in fact, there's many sort of similar conversations in terms of trade agreements and trade alliances kind of happening across the world. And I think that what we're going to see is we're going to see trade patterns changing, right? So I was in Canada last week, and as Richard alluded to, basically, it has become a national call to arms. So, Canadians, and I've seen it with my own eyes, basically, this is emotional. It's basically kind of tugs at their nationality. And what we're going to see from a kind of trade point of view, the buzzword basically in trade in Canadian government at the moment is export diversification. We've basically sold, most of our kind of exports for, as long as we can remember, to the US, and we're not going to do that as much of that anymore. So we got to diversify. We got to have a different plan, right? And look, I'm a glass half full guy. I do believe in looking for opportunity. And the reality for business, and you talked about a little bit, Patrick, in terms of your own business, is that sometimes we do coast along, and that 20-year customer that we've been selling to for 20 years at a certain price, and life's good, and there's kind of BMW in the driveway or whatever kind of the measure is. Actually, when you're in that sort of mind frame, you're kind of probably missing other opportunities, right? And sometimes, a little shock to the system about going out and kind of finding and sort of developing other opportunities is no bad thing, right? So I think basically kind of, getting creative and basically kind of diversifying and thinking about other opportunities is something I would certainly advocate. The other thing I would sort of say is that, ultimately, the fundamentals of being competitive and being differentiated in terms of your business don't go away. And so, tariffs are clearly a kind of huge factor and something to be dealt with, basically. But again, to my point, basically, does it act as a spur to think about basically kind of your business, think about basically efficiency, automation, AI? Is this the sort of the bit that might actually just kind of push you to sort of say, I think I've been putting off basically around basically kind of looking at that piece of automation or looking at how I become more productive? Is that maybe the spur to do this? Would be another challenge I would kind of give from a business point of view. I'm thinking about it very much in terms of my own business at the moment, basically, where basically we really are embracing kind of AI. We have a team of people here in Belfast that support our business across the world in terms of data and research and analytics. And we got to change that model. We got to embrace AI. We got to kind of think about would be more productive, even pre-tariffs. And we're not in a tariff business, thankfully, or at least not yet, in terms of services. But that may come as well. But I suppose the point will remain. The other thing I would say is all businesses, all sort of situations are not created equal. So back to my sort of travels, basically, kind of in the last couple of weeks, I met the guy who effectively runs the French government operation in New York a couple of weeks ago. And, he looked like a man that was sort of carrying the worries of the world on his shoulders, fur, brow, and French, emotion and all those kind of things, basically. And, kind of as we talked about it, kind of he was, very exercised, and rightly so. And I'm not in any way going to kind of sort of demean what he said, basically, about the impact on the French wine industry. Big import into the US, kind of French wine. And I kind of said to him, maybe just play devil's advocate for a second here, Frederic. What's the average selling price of a bottle of kind of premium French wine in the US? Gareth, we sell a lot of wine at over $100. Okay, fine. What is your kind of your producers? What do they sell to the distributor or sell to the customer at? Well, it's good margin business. We probably kind of sell a sort of 50 and they make 50 and kind of probably cost 10 kind of euros to produce the bottle. Okay, fine, that's good. And how price sensitive do you think basically the American consumer that's buying the bottle of $100 wine is? Yeah, good point, Gareth, actually, maybe. So again, only to say all things are not created equal. Equally, I'm advising a firm here at the moment from Northern Ireland, engineering company, basically selling into a very competitive kind of industry, kind of in the US, basically. And the MD of the firm said to me, kind of when all this started, basically, he said, Gareth, thank God we basically opened that factory in the US 3-4 years ago. Thank God we did that. So again, just to contrast basically the differences in terms of the business model, where in a competitive kind of lower margin industry that actually may not escape tariffs, thank God I opened a factory. Last time I looked, you can't basically open a French vineyard in the US, basically, so that's not an option. But basically, kind of thinking about the kind of business model as well. So, look, they're the things that I see kind of across the world. Couple of kind of final kind of comments just to sort of maybe kind of close the loop on the travel kind of piece. I've spent a bit of time in the last kind of month with France and Germany. I think the EU kind of piece that Richard kind of alluded to is interesting. Kind of it's funny, we've had all these shocks in the kind of global system, haven't we, in the last 5 years? Started with Brexit, went to COVID, is now kind of where we're at the moment, basically. Our relationship with the EU and Northern Ireland's relationship within that has been a kind of constant throughout. It's kind of interesting at one level that the UK has kind of got kind of I suppose the autonomy and the freedom to do trade deals, but the one that they most want to do is with the EU, so we can all work that one out kind of for ourselves basically. But I think actually the UK government has played it reasonably well in the last week. I think that they didn't do anything last week, despite the scant detail, but didn't do anything in the US agreement that would prejudice anything with the EU. So I think they've sort of deftly kind of stepped through it. So that's, I think, kind of closer to home. I've always, those of you who know me, been a big advocate for the opportunity here in Northern Ireland. I think dual market access is still under tapped in terms of basically an opportunity. I still think we need to bang the drum a lot more on that. I think this US piece is interesting insofar as basically if the UK strikes a more advantageous deal with the US than the EU does. I think that puts us in a really interesting space in Northern Ireland. Basically, probably people who are basically better placed than me in terms of the tax kind of lower level implications. We'll talk more to that. So I think that's it. And then the last place I've been, just to kind of sort of finish off the story in the last kind of 3 or 4 weeks, is in the Middle East. We've got a pretty kind of growing business in the Middle East. You've only got to look at what's going on there and what has gone on there in the last couple of days in terms of Trump. And I think that really speaks, to basically the change in geopolitics that's kind of happening kind of in the world. Basically, it's funny, I was speaking to a client yesterday, basically, and we were sort of almost thinking back in terms of, 10 years ago, the Middle East, yes, they're rich. We don't know an awful lot about them, was kind of the way they were perceived in the world. Now basically they're at the table brokering kind of peace talks kind of in various parts of the world. So rising basically kind of difference in terms of sort of geopolitics. Last bit linked to that basically is defense. I think basically we're seeing industries change, less money being spent on aid, more money being spent on defense. That has a ripple. You talk about ripple and diversification. So anyway, it feels like I'm going to have enough to be going to be doing for the next couple of years, and I hope you all will as well, basically. But it's about basically deftly sort of and having kind of nimble footwork as you think your way through.
Thanks, Gareth. Certainly concur. I think the changing trade patterns have been coming in for a couple of decades now. The rise of bilateral agreements, particularly in the global south, the rise of regional trade blocs have all indicated that patterns of trade are changing quite significantly, and we need to be very aware of where these movements are happening. So now, Lorraine, as we diversify our exports, as we reconfigure our supply chains, how are we going to keep right in terms of tax and compliance? What should we be aware of?
Yes, so I think on the compliance and so is the regulatory piece. So my sort of term that I've been sort of using over the last few months has been, dust off those Brexit plans everyone was looking at, sort of 4, 5, 6 years ago. Because a lot of those principles, the things that you need to look at, are similar here. And suppose Patrick has done a really good job this morning of sort of explaining the rules of origin. And the rules of origin really do underpin everything that you're looking at with customs. And I think that rules of origin work will always, stand by you. So you're going to be able to second guess. So there's things you can move in this to change it to be a UK product or an EU product. But then I think at the moment, because there's no actual deals being struck between the US and the EU, and the US and the UK's deal is scant at best. It's sort of like, it's a bit like anything in business, is what risk are you taking, as what side of the of the trade are you wanting to put your rules of origin. And suppose supply chain is not simple. Never mind trying to look at your supply chain for what the tariffs need to be, because there's obviously contingency plans, making sure you've got the supply of products. So it's sort of, again, it's a bit of a tax in, as don't let the tax tail wag the dog. Yes, I think there's lots of opportunity there for people to, be able to make the most of it. But I feel like at the moment you can't, because there's no
definitive way of what way you're going to do it. Is it going to change next week? Is it going to change next month? How long is that going to be in place for? And for you to do any sort of major change, which is, that significant process, and suppose what, customs rules of origin, there's sort of three main principles, is sort of what value add has been added here, what has changed in the process, and so is the origin of those materials that you're using. So, and then that's just a sort of broad, it delves into lots and lots of detail. But, if you do have a product, you've probably looked at this whenever you were looking at Brexit to try and understand what is your actual commodity code, and is that the correct commodity code for you? And then those commodity codes are international, so they fall into whatever agreement is going to happen, down the line. So it's always something to be very important that internally, because then at least you can quickly move and know what needs to be changed. I think the other thing is it's a bit of that comparison again to Brexit, is that in Northern Ireland, I think, Gareth, you're right, I think there's this dual access hasn't been used enough here. And I think with even the US-UK deal that we have at the moment, there's still that rules of origin allowing us to have those goods at risk. It depends where they're going to go, as long as they're not going into EU. So I think there does propose an opportunity here. How big that is probably still yet to be seen. But it's again just being ready to have your business ready to look at those. I think one thing is that we've probably been lucky here. Maybe lucky is a bit strong for a word. With the Windsor framework, and obviously with paperwork around the Trader Support Service. I'm sure there are a lot of businesses in the room where there's been fudging went on, where it's sort of like you phoned up and you've had assistance. We're probably not, we don't have that whenever we're going to the US. It's going to have to be correct. It's not a phone up the TSS and click a few buttons and hopefully no one comes and asks questions. And, it is surprising the amount of companies that you come across here that their TSS, their declarations, the supplementary declarations are just way behind and not done. And again, the UK revenue have been a wee bit lax. They haven't really been pushing too much around it. The IRS in the US don't take any prisoners. It's a very different beast. I think we've got a wee bit of leeway here. We just probably need to be a wee bit sharper when we're dealing with that US style of things, with the compliance and the paperwork will need to be spot on, or, so as Richard's point, sort of the stuff will be just stuck in the ports.